You're listening to The Conversation. Every September, many of the world's leaders fly to New York for the UN General Assembly. They stand in front of a green marble wall reading from a black lectern embossed with the UN symbol, two olive branches cupping the globe like a pair of hands. This year, the US refused to give Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, a visa to come to New York, sparking an international row. So Abbas won't be present to witness the expected recognition of a Palestinian state by France, Canada, Australia, and potentially the UK.
A tectonic shift in the past 2 weeks in diplomatic policy.
France will become the first G7 nation to officially recognise a Palestinian state in September.
Australia will follow France and the UK and officially
Now, the Canadian government is confirming it will soon recognise a Palestinian state if certain conditions are met.
And yet, for many Palestinians, the dream of an independent state feels more distant than ever. After 2 years of war following the Hamas-led attacks on Israel on October the 7th, a UN Commission of Inquiry has now concluded that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements have carved the occupied Palestinian territories into isolated enclaves, and members of the Israeli cabinet are calling for the annexation of the West Bank.
These announcements, they grab headlines, they spark debate. It looks like, once again, international recognition and statehood are just around the corner. But the pitfalls are all clear.
In this episode, we speak to historian Maher Nassar about the compromise that led to the original declaration of Palestinian independence in 1988, and how we've got to the point now where nearly 150 countries will recognise a state that she believes is more of a symbol than a meaningful route to Palestinian sovereignty. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, an independent news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics to help bring research knowledge to as many people as possible. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Maher Nassar, you're a historian specialising in Palestinian history and an associate professor at the University of Arizona in the US. You're a Palestinian American and you write extensively about Palestinian history. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start in 1967. It's the aftermath of the Six-Day War. What was it like to be a Palestinian in the occupied territories at that time?
Sure. So let's remember that over the course of 6 days, from June 5th to June 11th, 1967, Israel conquered and expanded its military control over the remainder of what was historic Palestine, including the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip.
These are the first pictures of the offensive in the Gaza Strip when the war was only hours old. The Israeli armor drove a wedge across the strip to Khan Yunis, cutting off thousands of men of the Palestine Liberation Force in Gaza City to the north.
And within days of that conquest, Israel decided not to extend citizenship to those Palestinians living in those areas. But at the same time, it didn't want to relinquish the lands it had just captured. So Israeli officials decided to rule over the Palestinians in these occupied territories through a series of military orders. And that's what became known as life under occupation. Now, many of those military orders remain in effect today. So, for example, Palestinians still have to request military permits from the Israeli army to do almost anything. So this permit system is a way of reminding Palestinians every day in every way that their lives are entirely controlled by Israel. In 1969, then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously said,
"When Britain got the mandate over Palestine, there was no such thing in this area as Palestinians. There were Jews and Arabs."
And the reason for that was to try to say, well, Palestinians don't exist as a people, so therefore they're just generic Arabs who can be settled anywhere else. So any expression of Palestinian national identity undermined that claim and therefore was treated as a threat. So Israel outlawed all public displays of the Palestinian flag and even artwork that bore the colors of the flag, red, green, white, black, was censored. Palestinians who waved the flag or displayed national identity expressions in the occupied territories could face up to 10 years in prison. So Palestinians got really creative really quickly. First, they experimented with lots of different ways to incorporate the colors of the flag in more subtle ways, even like stitching onto the traditional Palestinian robes or thobes, things like that. But even that started to get repressed, banned, confiscated, etc. So eventually, by the late 70s, early 80s, Palestinians turned to the watermelon, which we're seeing a comeback of these days. A sliced watermelon, when you look at a slice of watermelon that's opened up, what does it have? It has red flesh, green skin, black seeds, and the white rind. So the colors mirrored the banned Palestinian flag. So Palestinians started to carry images of sliced watermelon at protests or in markets or painted them in murals. It became a quiet act of defiance, especially when the flag itself was forbidden.
And where was the idea of an independent Palestinian state at this time amongst the Palestinian people?
We're now talking 20 years after the establishment of the State of Israel. And so for those 750,000 Palestinians who had been expelled or fled from their homes in 48, now there are over 1 million Palestinians, 2 decades out, still not allowed to return. And so they see themselves as refugees seeking to liberate their homeland. Palestinians, by 1968, 1969, their official political organ was something known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. By 1969, they were saying very clearly that they wanted to see a secular democratic Palestinian state in all of historic Palestine, in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews would all have equal rights. So that would have replaced Israel with a secular democratic state because they saw Israel as an illegitimate state that privileged Jews over non-Jews, that had no place in a modern world that was supposed to treat all citizens equally.
How did the goals of the Palestinian Liberation Movement and the PLO shift around this idea of statehood and what it could be?
So in the early 70s, we see several changes happening, both at an international level as well as on the ground. So internationally, you'll remember we have the 1973 October War.
Reminders of the Six-Day War, Egyptian lorries and tanks. The first news was broadcast that the Israelis had crossed the Suez Canal.
The results of which opened the door towards greater diplomacy between Israel and the Arab states. And so the Arab states themselves were moving from a stance of confrontation with Israel to one of greater diplomacy and negotiations. Meanwhile, the Israeli occupation was deepening and entrenching itself in the occupied territories. Settlements were now starting to be built, especially in the West Bank, that was gobbling up Palestinian land. So Palestinians living under occupation saw this as a very acute threat that needed an immediate response that couldn't wait for a longer-term solution. And then the PLO itself in the 1970s was largely dismissed by America, by Israel, by the West, as just a terrorist organization. So they were seeking greater international legitimacy. So there were Palestinians telling the PLO leadership, maybe if you moderated your stances a bit, maybe if you weren't quite so defiant in the face of the international consensus that supports Israel, maybe you could gain some more incremental gains. And then you had Palestinians in the occupied territories who were not allowed to be a part of the PLO. Any membership of the PLO at the time got you thrown into jail by the Israelis. But they were still sending signals to the PLO leadership outside, that was at this point in Lebanon and Beirut, hey, maybe we need to adopt this more gradualist approach.
So what then happened? How did the PLO leadership respond?
The PLO leadership responded in 1974 by issuing what became known as the 10-point plan. Their main goal now was to establish a national authority in any part of Palestine that's liberated. So they moved from saying we want to liberate all of Palestine to saying we want to establish a national authority in any part of Palestine that's liberated. So it was a way of threading the needle of signaling to the moderates that we're going to adopt a more gradualist position, but also telling the rejectionist front we're not giving up completely on the idea of liberating all of Palestine.
What else was happening at this time in the region that affected this shift?
So you had the Lebanese Civil War that started in 1974 and continued until 1990. That shifted the balance of power. Eventually, the PLO would be kicked out of Lebanon after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and shipped off to faraway Tunisia. We have the Soviet Union, which had been a backer of anti-colonial movements and the PLO specifically, becoming weaker and weaker vis-a-vis the United States. So Palestinians are looking around, they're seeing an ascendant U.S. power as an international power and power broker, the Soviet Union weakening, and again, the Israeli project of occupation, of settlement building, getting more and more entrenched in the occupied territories. So the calculation was that the idea of liberating all of Palestine seems further and further away. And so the goal of ending the occupation, which had some international support, seems more doable as we move into the 1980s.
So these are the real origins of the two-state solution, this period in the 70s.
It is. It's very much the origins. The other piece of it that's important to remember as well is the 1978 Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt that resulted in the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty in 1979.
Let there be no more wars or bloodshed between Arabs and Israelis.
Initially, Egypt had wanted there to be some language around Palestinian statehood and independence and an end to the occupation built into that agreement. But the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, was firmly against that. So what they ended up formulating was a language around Palestinian autonomy, which is different than independence. Autonomy means self-rule over some aspects of Palestinian life, with Israel still retaining control over things like borders and resources and security and economy and so forth.
Let's move forward a few years to 1987, and the first Intifada, or uprising, erupts in the occupied Palestinian territories. Paint me a picture of what was happening on the ground at this moment.
So by December 1987, the occupation was now over 20 years old. A whole generation of Palestinians have only known those checkpoints and permits and soldiers patrolling their streets. They've only known a lack of freedom. And so quite spontaneously, actually, there was an uprising that starts in December 1987 in Gaza, in Jabalia, as a matter of fact, which we hear in the news about these days, but spread very quickly across the Gaza Strip and into the West Bank. So unlike earlier moments of resistance that were largely led by guerrilla forces outside of historic Palestine, this was inside Palestine, inside the occupied territories, was largely unarmed and was largely grassroots. So imagine teachers and shopkeepers and farmers and students, women's groups, all kinds of people organizing together, coordinating their efforts to try to make the occupation impossible. So collective defiance, collective refusal to pay taxes, collective refusal to open up their shops. So it's really the first time the international community is also seeing the Palestinians not just as refugees to be pitied or guerrilla fighters to be feared, but as an actual national group of people seeking legitimate rights and liberation.
How did the leadership of the PLO respond to that first Intifada?
They were caught off guard. They weren't expecting this. They didn't know it was happening. And the Palestinian leadership on the ground in the occupied territories initially organized on their own. They then reached out to the PLO leadership over in Tunisia to say, hey, we need your support. We need your connections to the international community to try to push for a diplomatic solution that would lead to an end to the occupation, lead to Palestinian independence in the occupied territories. And the PLO responds to this and responds to the global attention that's now being paid to the Palestinian cause by issuing a declaration of independence in November of 1988 that declares Palestinian independence on the territories occupied in 1967. So the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem. The declaration itself was read by Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, in Algiers at the PNC meeting, the Palestinian National Congress meeting. It was written by Mahmoud Darwish, who's a famed Palestinian poet who actually grew up inside Israel. So it's this moment of unity among all the different fragmented parts of the Palestinian population. It was also a moment of tremendous hope, this belief that maybe now finally Palestinians can gain what they've been working for at this point 40 years. So it was this real moment of possibility. At the same time, many Palestinians saw this as a huge compromise because by declaring Palestinian independence, even though it was symbolic, even though it wasn't actually liberated yet, it was limiting the horizons of Palestinian independence because the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem comprise about 22% of historic Palestine. So what that Declaration of Independence also effectively meant was that Palestinians were giving up on the other 78% of their land that was now recognized as the State of Israel. So it was bittersweet. It was bittersweet at that moment.
How did the international community react and how did Israel react to it?
It was split. So formerly colonized countries of the global south, many of them recognized Palestinian independence right away. I think some 70 countries did initially. Israel rejected it outright. The United States rejected it outright. And just to give you like a sense of how this played out, in December 1988, so a month after the declaration, Yasser Arafat was scheduled to address the United Nations at its headquarters in New York City. But the United States didn't give Arafat a visa to the United States. So the UN meeting had to be moved to Geneva.
The UN General Assembly is making a quick trip to Geneva so it can hear a speech by PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat.
The Americans kept insisting that the PLO renounce terrorism. That was the language they were using to try to get the PLO to say, essentially, we're no longer going to be engaged in any kind of armed struggle. By December 1988, Arafat acceded essentially to that request. And at that point, the United States and Israel started to recognize the PLO as a body with whom to negotiate. But the idea of recognizing an independent Palestinian state still wasn't on the table.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Maha, 5 years after the 1988 Declaration of Palestinian Independence, PLO leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, shook hands on the White House lawn as part of what became known as the Oslo Accords.
Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that you remain seated during the document signing.
A little plug here, back in 2023, on the 30th anniversary of that meeting, we ran a special 3-part podcast series on The Conversation Weekly, featuring interviews with those involved in the negotiations, including from the Israeli and the Palestinian delegations. And we'll put a link in our show notes to where you can listen back to that. Maha, in your view, what did the Oslo Accords come to mean for the pursuit of a Palestinian state?
So initially, the Oslo Accords were billed as the first step towards enacting a process that would eventually lead towards a two-state solution. So a lot of Palestinians were quite excited initially because they saw it as indeed a step forward towards statehood. Other Palestinians were more skeptical, including Mahmoud Darwish, author of the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, Edward Said, the famed Palestinian American intellectual. They recognized that the language of Oslo was actually a poison pill, because the actual language of the agreement said nothing about a Palestinian state. It only said that Israel would now recognize the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people and enter into negotiations with it. So it was billed as the first step towards a two-state solution, but in reality, the Oslo Accords really was the moment when the hope of a two-state solution began to be strangled. And what I mean by that is that on the ground, the actual enactment of what became known as the Oslo Accords did not provide a pathway towards statehood or sovereignty. It only created a fragmented system of Palestinian autonomy. So autonomy meant that Palestinians could oversee some aspects of, like, municipal services, for example. They can oversee the collection of the garbage and the health clinics and things like that. But the real heft of what it means to be independent, controlling your own land, your own resources, your own borders, all that was still being controlled fully by Israel. Israel was also expanding its settlements. And in fact, settlement expansion accelerated at this time, eating up more and more land that was supposed to form the basis of that future Palestinian state. The Oslo Accords set up something that was called the Palestinian Authority. This was a nod towards that national authority that the PLO had called for back in 1974. But it was effectively stripped of all national powers. So it turned into a kind of subcontractor for Israel. It would arrest people on Israel's behalf. It would prevent uprisings against Israeli settlements. So in essence, what that means is that rather than dismantling the occupation, the Oslo Accords further entrenched the Israeli occupation and hemmed in Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas.
So as it became clear to Palestinians and their leaders that actually the Oslo Accords, they were failing to really get any progress on a two-state solution, I think this was by the early 2000s, what then happened?
So as early as the late 90s, Palestinians realized that this Oslo process was a path to nowhere. So that's why we see first the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000. That goes until 2005. It was an armed intifada, unlike the first intifada, which was largely unarmed. It was much more violent, much more exacting of a price on both Israelis and Palestinians. And by 2005, the Palestinians had been quite exhausted. There's now new PLO leadership in the figure of Mahmoud Abbas. And so he decides to try to push for an international diplomatic solution by going back to the United Nations to seek recognition officially of Palestinian statehood. This was both a way to bypass the direct negotiations of the Oslo framework that were leading nowhere, and also a way to try to gain through diplomacy what they were not able to gain neither through negotiations nor through mass mobilization nor through uprisings.
And how successful was this new approach, this diplomatic effort to put the emphasis back on statehood and recognition?
It had some symbolic traction. In 2012, the UN General Assembly did vote to upgrade Palestine's status.
UN delegates applauded an overwhelming vote, 138 in favor of the enhanced Palestinian status. The United States was among 9 countries opposed.
The PLO initially was a non-member observer, and then it was elevated to this other thing called a non-member observer state. So in theory, it looked like progress. Palestine now had access to international bodies like the International Criminal Court, the ICJ, but nothing meaningful came out of it, because the way that the UN works is that real change happens at the UN Security Council, not at the UN General Assembly. And at the UN Security Council, the US has a veto. So the US used its veto to block full membership, and Israel just ignored what were essentially symbolic votes. and just kept doing what it was doing.
I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps.
The UK, France and Canada have threatened Israel with recognition of a Palestinian state in September at the UN. Given this history that we've just heard and that you've tracked for us, how do you react to that?
So I think the operative word here is threatened. What does it mean to threaten Israel with recognizing Palestinian statehood? What it means is that these are really gestures meant more to exert pressure on Israel, I think, in order to ease their own consciences over the genocide that's happening in Gaza now, and that it's less about advancing Palestinian freedom. The reason I say that is that these announcements, again, they grab headlines, they spark debate. It looks like, once again, international recognition and statehood are just around the corner. But the pitfalls are all clear, and there are many of the same pitfalls that we've just discussed. Symbolic recognition doesn't stop settlement expansion. It doesn't lift the blockade on Gaza, doesn't end Israeli military control over the West Bank. So my concern here is that these threats to recognize statehood are really just a repetition of the same pattern that we've seen for decades now. Fanfare abroad, stagnation at home. And what's even worse now, in the face of what we're seeing right now with international scholars recognizing that what's happening in Gaza right now is a genocide, my fear now is that these Western governments, rather than hold Israel accountable to its documented war crimes in Gaza, are going to instead use this as a distraction and as a way of claiming they support Palestinian rights without actually pressuring Israel to end its campaign in Gaza, to allow reconstruction, and so forth. So honestly, it feels cynical to me right now.
And is a Palestinian state, in your view, still viable along the lines of what was declared in 1988 or even along the lines of Oslo?
Honestly, it's hard for me to see how. The main reason is the geography itself. Israeli settlements have carved up the West Bank into these isolated enclaves. Many people call them Bantustans because they look like what South Africa did during the apartheid years. And even with the most recent announcement about building settlements in the E1 corridor, it's hard to understand them unless you know the geography of the West Bank. But effectively what they're doing is isolating Palestinians in the West Bank into these little islands. So that you can't even travel from one town to another in the West Bank itself without crossing Israeli checkpoints, without needing Israeli permits, and so forth. So I don't see how a Palestinian state like that could survive. It doesn't fulfill the basic definitions of sovereignty.
Well, thank you, Maha, for talking us through that history. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware. Sound design is by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us by going to donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.